Israeli psychologist Daniel Kahneman, in his book Thinking Fast and Slow, outlines two systems of thinking, which are based on research that he conducted over decades, along with his thought partner of many years, Amos Tversky. System 2 thinking is our more rational, logical, deliberative system of thinking. It's effortful. It feels like work. This is our slower thinking system and is what is in use when we are consciously processing and making deliberative decisions. Just as important is System 1 thinking, which plays a huge role in our decision-making capabilities. System 1 thinking is more intuitive and automatic. It's the system we're using when we're making decisions throughout the day without even realizing it. In this module, we will be talking about heuristics, or cognitive shortcuts, that are a fundamental property of System 1 thinking. Heuristics are mental shortcuts that allow people to make decisions quickly and efficiently. They can be thought of as rules of thumb our minds use. We need heuristics because there's simply too much information in the world, and our cognitive system cannot process it all. So we evolved these very helpful shortcuts to help us simplify the massive amount of information that we're always taking in, and to help us preserve our mental and physical resources. And generally, heuristics are really helpful. They help our cognitive system do its job and make decisions quickly. And they allow humans to function without having to stop to consider every course of action. For example, imagine how difficult driving would be if you had to consciously think, press the gas now, or if I need to go right, I need to turn the wheel that way. We need to be able to do these things automatically. But sometimes this very helpful hardwiring can lead to errors. And an understanding of some of the more common errors that can result from these mental shortcuts can help us recognize and potentially resist their effects. Now, our decision-making system isn't the only cognitive system that relies on heuristics. Our visual system does as well. This example here is called the Ebbinghaus illusion. And typically, when we ask participants which red circle is bigger, most people see the circle on the right as bigger. But as you can see, when we move this box from the red circle on the right across the screen over to the one on the left, like I'm doing now, it becomes clear that really they are the exact same size. And the reason that they look different is because of a shortcut our visual system uses. We evaluate the size of objects based on the things near it. And in this case, the smaller circles around the circle on the right make it look bigger. Here's another example called the ponzo or railroad track illusion. These two orange lines on the railroad track appear to be different sizes, even though, as we can see when I add the blue lines, they are the same size. And this is because if two objects project as the same size on our retina, but one is believed to be further away, the further away object appears larger. And that's because our brains are wired to account for distance and perspective, and that is generally very helpful and useful as we move through the world. Here's another example with three cars that appear to be different sizes, but when I move this box from one car to the next, you can see here that they are in fact all the same size. And yet, even when we know these cars are the same size, our brain still sees them as being different. So sometimes just knowing about the heuristic is not enough to override it. Here's a final powerful example. Believe it or not, the two squares labeled A and B are the same color. And we can show you that here. And we've actually pulled the colors off of the checkerboard so you can see they really are the same. The illusion that they are different shades occurs because of the way our system processes luminance. Square B feels like it's lighter because it's surrounded by dark squares, even though the shadow from the cylinder is making it the same shade as square A. Now, optical illusions are not really a central focus of decision education. The point here is that many parts of the human cognitive system, from the visual system to decision making, use heuristics or evolved hardwired shortcuts, and most of the time they allow us to function. But as you can see now, they can trick us sometimes. And in this module, we'll be focusing specifically on how heuristics impact decision making and how the errors they produce, known as cognitive biases, can impact our judgment. By knowing about these cognitive biases, we can be more attuned to recognizing when they occur and how to mitigate their influence on the decisions we make. Now, take a quick moment here to think about what this object is. Some people look at this and immediately see a rabbit. Other people look at it and they immediately see a duck. What's happening is that our perceptual system just made a decision. We didn't notice it was making a decision, but we took the information that was available and produced the idea that this was either a bunny or a duck. Very rarely do people get the sense of both animals at once. We usually see one first, and when we know or hear about the other or spend even a half a second longer, we can see the other. This is what our decision-making system does when it incorporates information from everyday life. This isn't an illusion. In situations, we get presented with a set of stimuli in our environment, and we respond by making meaning of it using shortcuts. We don't look at this image and immediately make an either-or judgment. We don't ask ourselves, is this a rabbit or a duck? We just think, what is it? And the answer for each one of us relies on how our brains interpret the stimuli in the picture. In this module, we are going to be covering 10 common cognitive biases or cognitive errors that can impact decision-making. As of this recording, decision scientists have identified dozens of biases and keep identifying more. The 10 we will be exploring in this session are availability, representativeness, anchoring and adjustment, confirmation bias, hindsight bias, fundamental attribution error, halo effect, framing effect, sunk cost, and polarized thinking. We will also explore bias blind spot, and we will talk about opportunities for reducing cognitive bias. In this video, we will explore the availability heuristic, which is a cognitive bias in which we judge more memorable experiences as more probable, even if they aren't. To explore how this bias impacts our judgment, let's begin by looking at this question here. Is the letter K more likely to be found in the first position or the third position of a word? This was a question that Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky asked to research study participants. Now, the correct answer to this question is B. Words in which K is in the third position are more common. So think cake, bike, poke. But when participants were presented with this question, most chose option A, words that have the letter K in the first position. And this is because they could more easily bring to mind examples of words that start with the letter K. So kite, kitchen, kangaroo, kitten, keys. It was much harder to bring to mind words that had the letter K in the third position. Because it's harder to generate examples of words with K in the third position, we incorrectly judge that answer to be less probable. For most things, when we can generate more examples in our minds, we often incorrectly judge something as more probable. And this is the availability heuristic. We judge more memorable examples as more probable, even if they aren't. Let's look at an example of the availability heuristic as it plays out in real life. So 2 different groups of students were asked to fill out course evaluations. One group was asked to share 2 ways to improve the course they had taken, and the other group was asked to share 10 ways to improve the course. It was the same course. Then they answered some other questions, and finally they were asked to give the course an overall rating and share how much they enjoyed the course. So what happened was that the group of students that were asked to list 10 ways to improve the course actually gave the course a higher rating overall. Now, why would this happen? Well, given what we know about the availability heuristic, what happened was that it was pretty challenging to come up with 10 improvements. And they had this memory in their mind that they couldn't come up with 10 ways. That's a lot of ways. So they ended up thinking, well, this must have been a great class. What was memorable, having difficulty coming up with the improvements, impacted their judgment. Now remember, the definition of the availability heuristic is that more memorable examples are judged as more probable. So this other group only had to come up with 2 ways to improve the course. Super memorable. Since coming up with those few memorable improvements was so easy, it led to a sense that improvements must be numerous, there surely must be many improvements, and so the class could not have been very good. Now, Remember, the quality of the class did not actually change. They were all in the same class, but their judgment about it did. The availability heuristic leads us to judge more memorable examples as more probable, and that can significantly affect our judgment. This comic here illustrates how this might play out in a real scenario. So we see these two folks sitting on the beach reading the newspaper that says second shark death in 5 years. And the person reading the paper says they must have a death wish to swim in that water, as he's looking at the folks swimming in the ocean. So because the man is reading in the newspaper about the recent shark death, what feels most memorable, shark attacks in the water, feels more probable, even though in reality, in 5 years, there have only been 2 shark attacks. And this comic is just one example of how the availability heuristic can lead people to make errors in judgment based on the examples or memories that come easily to mind. In this video, we will explore the representativeness heuristic, which involves estimating the likelihood of an event by comparing it to an existing model that already exists in our minds. So here's a classic example to demonstrate the representativeness heuristic. This is a somewhat dated example, but it illustrates the heuristic well. So people in the 1980s were shown this description of a woman named Linda, and they were told that Linda's 31 years old, she's single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. And then they were asked, which is more likely? Is Linda a bank teller or a bank teller who's a feminist? And most people chose option B, thinking it was more likely that Linda was a feminist bank teller. And this is because there were lots of things in the description that were representative of what many people in the 1980s saw as qualities of a feminist. Ideas about feminism and what represents a feminist have shifted and evolved since then, but the takeaway remains. The correct answer to this should simply be that it's more likely that she's a bank teller with no other descriptors. Why? It's because it's not possible for it to be more probable you're a feminist bank teller than simply a bank teller. Feminist bank tellers are a subset of bank tellers overall. So regardless of what we know about Linda, it's always going to be more probable that she's only a bank teller. But participants mostly got this question wrong because of the representativeness heuristic. When deciding how likely it is that an event or object belongs to a category, we tend to make this judgment based on how closely the event or object matches the typical member of that category. So participants in the 1980s felt that this description of Linda more closely matched a typical feminist than a typical bank teller, and so they incorrectly judged it was more likely for her to be a bank teller who was a feminist. Let's look at another example. Researchers pose questions like this to students in 3rd through 8th grade. So this is just an example, but which are you more likely to see on a rainy day? People walking or people walking with umbrellas? Students were given the question and then they were asked to write down their answers. Based on what we just discussed about Linda, we know that the correct answer should just be walking. That's a bigger category. The subset of people walking with umbrellas would have to be smaller. But when they did this experiment with students, a good chunk of them wrote down walking with umbrellas. And we call this a typical condition, meaning that rain and walking with umbrellas are 2 conditions that generally go together. To compare, when students were asked the same question using an atypical scenario, so on a rainy day, are there more people walking or more people walking without umbrellas, there were still some errors. We can see here on this blue bar that about 30% of the responses were still incorrect, even in the atypical situation, but there were more errors made in the typical example, as we see here on this orange bar. So what does this tell us about the representativeness heuristic? Well, it tells us that 1, it's very pervasive. 60% of respondents gave the wrong answer. But also, why are we making more mistakes in the so-called typical condition? It's because when we're in a rainy situation, people who are walking with umbrellas are much more representative of what we see out on the street, or what is more common for that situation. Let's look at one more example of representativeness. In a classic study, participants were asked if a fair 6-sided die is tossed 10 times, Which of these two sequences is more likely? Now, you might know that both of these sequences are equally likely, but the vast majority of participants say option B is more likely. And why do they say this? It's because sequence B is more representative of randomness. It feels random, and we know randomness is what underlies a fair dice toss result. So because this sequence of numbers represents a more familiar mental model of randomness, we're more likely to choose this option, even though they are both equally likely. Now, why are they both equally likely? Well, even though option B looks more random, it's actually a specific sequence of numbers, and the likelihood that you would toss that exact sequence of numbers is no more likely than the probability of tossing the sequence of all ones. We see this misunderstanding of randomness in another phenomenon called the gambler's fallacy. The gambler's fallacy is an erroneous belief that if an event occurred less than expected in the past, it's more likely to occur in the future. So for example, if I tossed a coin and it landed on heads 3 times in a row, I might erroneously think that it's much more likely to land on tails next time, because this feels more random. Or if you're playing roulette and you land on red 3 times in a row, you might be inclined to bet it all on black the next time, because again, getting the same color many times in a row feels less random than getting a mix of red and black. We're fooled into thinking that what is more representative of randomness is actually more likely, when of course we know that each toss of the coin or each spin of the roulette wheel is completely unrelated to whatever happened in previous turns. In this video, we will be talking about the anchoring and adjustment heuristic. This heuristic leads us to make decisions based on the first piece of information we receive. We anchor ourselves to it as if it's the most important data point, even if it's inaccurate or off base. So to begin, let's look at this classic study in which participants were given 5 seconds to estimate the answer to a math problem. Group 1 was shown the problem set up in this way, and Group 2 was shown the same problem set up like this. This is a very long sequence of numbers, but you can probably note pretty quickly that both answers should be the same. Remember, participants weren't given time to solve the problem, but had 5 seconds to give their best estimate of the answer. And in Group 2, it turned out that the estimates were much higher than in Group 1. So why would that be? Well, when we're asked to estimate quantities, we adjust, usually insufficiently, based on an initial anchor. In this case, the initially presented anchor in Group 2's equations were these higher numbers that they looked at first, so 8, 7, 6, etc. And what generally happened was that in Group 1, people started multiplying these smaller numbers first. They get pretty far through the sequence before the 5 seconds is up. Their product isn't that high yet, so their initial anchor is pretty low. Whereas in Group 2, people started doing multiplication with these higher numbers first. Even though they're just estimating, they pretty quickly get well over 300 by multiplying 8 times 7 times 6. And they still have more numbers in the sequence. So the Group 2 participants end up estimating their answer much higher than Group 1 because they're adjusting to this initial anchor of these higher numbers. Interestingly, however, both groups underestimate the answer, and this is because the adjustment part of the process is usually insufficient. Let's look at another example of this in another study. So in another classic experiment, people were asked to estimate the population of Chicago. But before that, both groups were asked to make a greater or less than judgment about the population. One group had a smaller initial anchor and one group had a larger initial anchor, which you can see here. One group was presented 500,000 as an anchor for the population. One group was presented 1,500,000. And what they found was that the group with the larger anchor gave the larger answer estimate to the same question of what is the population of Chicago. So the anchor of simply being presented with a larger number or a smaller number influenced people's judgments, and in this case, their population estimates. And finally, we can see the anchoring and adjustment heuristic played out in this comic. So in this comic, we see this person proudly showing off this unpleasant stuffed fox and feeling like they got a great price at $4,500 because they were basing their estimate of what it should be worth on the initial anchor that was presented to them of the seller's asking price, which was $5,000. So when this person estimated the worth, he clearly adjusted his thinking from the starting price, and as is the case in many instances of anchoring, he adjusted insufficiently. In real life, this can show up in the way that products are advertised. So for example, it may seem expensive to spend nearly $7 on a pack of very basic five very basic ballpoint pens. But if we are anchored at close to $7 and we adjust down a bit, suddenly $5.69 seems like a reasonable price. So stores will often display an original price and then show the markdown, which makes us feel like we're getting a great deal, even if we may not be. And that's because of the anchoring and adjustment heuristic. In this video, we will talk about confirmation bias, which is when we look for or look more favorably on information that supports what we already think. Let's look at a classic experiment that illustrates confirmation bias really well. People came into a lab and took an IQ test. Now, researchers didn't even bother to score it, but they told some of the participants that they had a high IQ and some of the participants that they had a low IQ. Then everyone was left in a waiting room and given some time to look over magazine articles. And there were some articles that supported the validity of the IQ test and some articles that criticized it. Lo and behold, those that were told they have a high IQ read up about its validity, and those who were told they had a low IQ wanted to check out articles that criticized IQ tests. So this illustrates that we tend to seek out the information that confirms our beliefs or what we want to believe. So if we're told we have a high IQ, we want to confirm the belief that this is a really valid test. If we're told that we have a low IQ, we want to confirm the belief that the IQ is a problematic or invalid test. Here's another classic lab study in which participants were shown 4 cards and were told that each card has a letter on one side and a number on the other. Then they were given a rule that if there is a vowel on one side, then there is an even number on the other. And they were asked which 2 cards they would flip to test out this rule. And these are the cards they were given. So when people did this scenario in the lab, most people picked E as their first card, which is the correct answer. Flipping over the E tells us if indeed there is an even number on the back. And the second card that most participants pick is the 4. Presumably aiming to see if there is a vowel on the back of the 4. And that is incorrect. And this is the confirmation bias at play. Basically, participants had a rule in mind that a vowel on one side means an even number on the other, and they turn over the 4 hoping there's a vowel on the back to prove their rule. But what they're forgetting is that the rule doesn't say anything about what's on the back of a card with an even number. The rule only tells us that if there's a vowel on one side, there has to be an even number on the other. So the card that we should use to test that could potentially falsify the rule would be the odd number, the 7 card. Because if there's a vowel on the back of that, we know that the rule is false. But rather than look for evidence that would potentially disconfirm what we're hoping to find, people like to look for evidence that confirms what they already believe. So if this card, the 4, had a vowel on the back, that would confirm the rule they were trying to prove. Interestingly, when participants engaged in a similar exercise but with cards that had a beverage on one side and an age on the other, they fared much better. So in this scenario, participants were told that the rule is that if a person is drinking beer, they must be 21 years or older. And most participants correctly chose to flip over the beer card and the 16 card to test the rule. Test if the rule was correct. So if the 16-year-old is drinking beer, then we know the rule is false. The reason that participants did so much better in this scenario is because there's a lot more real-world context to draw from. They're used to the idea of people checking for underage drinking, and they understand how to navigate this scenario more rationally. So an important takeaway here is that the fact that whether you do or do not have knowledge in a certain domain matters for your decisions and your ability to reason correctly. In the case of the examples we just saw, the decision-making skills that participants were able to apply in the drinking and age scenario didn't transfer to the scenario with the letters and numbers. So when thinking about classrooms, this only adds to the argument for giving students exposure to content and examples across disciplines and outside of academic learning so that they can be more aware of their biases and how they play out in different domains. So in this comic, we see the confirmation bias highlighted in a way that's very relatable to the traps many of us fall into when researching topics that we feel passionately about. This person, who is a proud member of the Flat Earth Society, is deeply swayed and drawn to the one book that confirms what he already believes, despite the fact that there is a much larger library of books around him, and even the globe, that disconfirm his belief that the Earth is flat. And this is the confirmation bias at play. In this video, we will talk about hindsight bias, which is the tendency to overestimate in retrospect what we knew before the correct or outcome information was provided. Or more simply, we believe that past events were more predictable than they really were. Let's look at this study that illustrates the hindsight bias. So in this study, students answered some questions about facts about animals or geography, like how many months are elephants pregnant, or how many countries are there in Africa? And then they were asked the same questions again, but the second time they were asked the questions, their task was simply to state what their previous answer had been when they were asked the first time. So this was really just a memory task. And then what the researchers did was that for some items, the experimental items, they also included the correct answers and included a blurb that said, please do not let yourself be influenced by these correct answers. Just try to remember your own answer that you previously wrote down. It's best if you just write down the very same answer you previously wrote. So they were very straightforward about what they were asking for. And here you can see a graph directly from this research that highlights a couple of interesting points. So here on the y-axis, we can see how they computed how much closer the answer they gave for the memory of their previous answer was to the actual correct answer. You can think of this as a measure of their memory error. And also down here, you can see the graph divided by those experimental items in which the researchers gave the correct answer to participants before they shared their memory of what they answered before, and the control group in which they were not given the correct answer. So one thing we can notice is that there's a lot more shifting towards the correct answer on the items for which the researchers shared the correct answer. Now, this might not be surprising, but remember, the task is just to remember what you said before. There's no reason to believe, other than the hindsight bias, that a person's memory would be worse in one condition versus the other. Their memory isn't worse. They're just being biased by that information that was given to them about the correct answer and thinking that they might have known it already. The other thing that's interesting to note is that they did this study with 9-year-olds, 12-year-olds, and adults, and the bias seems to be stronger for children, which is the white and gray lines, than it is for adults, which is the black lines, which is something for educators to be aware of. Now, let's look at a couple examples of hindsight bias that you might experience in classrooms or in the real world. So first, we see this example from the classroom. When the teacher said the Empire State Building is 1,453 feet high, Daniel, age 9, exclaimed, "I knew it was that high," when in fact, he had never before encountered this information. So this is an example of hindsight bias, which is the tendency to overestimate in retrospect what we knew before the correct or outcome information was provided. And this comic is just another simple illustration of hindsight bias. So we see this person on a stretcher, and his friends are saying, although we gave him all that money and support, I always had my doubts that Jim could build his own helicopter. But they gave him all that money and support, presumably because they believed in Jim. And once they saw it all went wrong, now they're quick to say, well, I always had my doubts. So this is that tendency, again, to overestimate in retrospect what we knew before the correct or outcome information was provided. And this is the hindsight bias. In this video, we will be discussing the fundamental attribution error. This error leads people to overestimate personality-based influences and to underestimate the effect of context when explaining others' behavior. In other words, we believe that people's personality traits have more influence on their actions than do other factors over which they don't have control. So let's explore what we mean by this and what researchers have studied about it. So in this experiment from the 1980s, participants came into a lab and were told that they were going to read an essay that someone else wrote, and they were going to learn about the circumstances under which the person wrote the essay. And the circumstances under which these essays were supposedly written are very important because they were conditions that the essay writers didn't have control over. So essay writers supposedly came in and were told by researchers that they would like them to write an essay either in favor of or opposing affirmative action. And the important thing to remember here is that the essay writers were told which positions to take in their writing. They did not get to choose. So the essays did not necessarily reflect their own personal beliefs. So the current participants read the essay, and then they had to answer whether or not they thought the essay writer actually favored the issue or not. And overall, participants were more likely to think that the essay writers themselves personally held the opinions that they were forced to write about. And this is the fundamental attribution error. People tend to overestimate personality-based influences and to underestimate the effect of context when explaining others' behavior. So remember here, the context is these people were forced to write on a topic. Their personality had nothing to do with it. They were told what to write about. And what's interesting here is that the current participants had no other information about the essay writers other than that they were told what to write. So they know this is why they wrote what they wrote, and they have full confirmation that this essay has nothing to do with the essay writer's personality or personal beliefs. And what was surprising to researchers was that participants overall believed that the writer's own personal opinions matched the arguments that they made in their essays. So despite knowing the context, they made this error in judgment. Here we see the fundamental attribution error expressed visually in this graphic from the decision lab. So the stick person on the left shows up late because there was a lot of traffic. That was the context of the situation and the ensuing lateness. And actually, the stick figure friend gives this context to his friends. But the other stick people attribute the lateness to their friend's personality rather than to the context of the situation. So instead of, wow, there was a lot of traffic, that's why you're late, they respond with, you're flawed as a human. And this is an example of the fundamental attribution error and something that we all are commonly susceptible to. Next, let's talk about the halo effect. This is when we assume that our positive impressions of someone or something in a particular area transcends to all other areas as well. So let's begin by looking at a comic that illustrates the halo effect. So in this comic here, we see a little dog walking along when this other luxurious dog walks by, and our friend thinks, wow, this dog is stunning, it's perfect, it's got this gorgeous fur. So our original dog falls prey to the halo effect. Our brains want to view others homogeneously. So here our dog thinks, wow, this dog is so lovely to look at. It must be a really good dog. When in reality, the dog behaves really badly and tears up the furniture and generally makes a mess of the house. When we see some positive aspects to a person, we want to assume that they are good across the board. And this is the halo effect, which can generally be described as a cognitive bias leading to a homogeneous perception of a person. Let's talk about a real study in a lab that looked at this effect. So in this study, which was done in a university setting, researchers asked participants to watch one of two videotaped job applications. And based on what they saw in the video, researchers wanted participants to rate the applicant on a variety of characteristics. Now, to give a little more background, the same person appeared in both videos. In both videos, it's the same French-speaking Belgian man speaking English with a pronounced accent. However, in one of the videos, he presented himself in a warm manner. He was friendly, portrayed himself as a likable teacher who engages with his students. He's flexible in his approach to teaching. He's enthusiastic about his subject matter. In the cold version, it's the same man, but he portrays himself as rigid, distrustful towards his students, and somewhat unlikable. Then researchers had the participants rate the man on a number of characteristics. So how much they liked him, his personality, his physical attractiveness, and his accent. And not surprisingly, people watching the Warm video rated him much higher in terms of likability and personality. They liked him more, they liked his personality more. This isn't surprising. The experiment was manipulated to make him seem more likable in the Warm video. What is interesting was that the participants in the Warm group also rated him much higher in terms of his physical attractiveness and his accent, despite the fact that the same guy looks the same and has the same accent in both conditions. And this is the halo effect. Essentially, these Warm characteristics cause a spillover effect into the two characteristics that were actually the same across the two conditions. The halo effect occurs when our evaluation of one characteristic of a person, like for example intelligence, influences how we evaluate that same person in other different characteristics. So for example, attractiveness. In schools, this might show up, for example, when a teacher judges a student who is friendlier or more helpful as producing better work, even if their work looks quite similar to a student who misbehaves or is defiant. And that is the halo effect in action. In this video, we will be discussing the framing effect, which is when we're influenced not by information itself, but by how the information is presented or framed. And we'll begin by looking at an adaptation of a classic study that we've updated to a scenario we thought might feel more relevant to educators. Imagine your school district is facing a crisis where you expect to lose $100,000 from the budget. You're asked to choose between two plans. In one group of participants, the two plans they could choose from look like these A or B choices. In the other group, the two plans they could choose from look like these A or B choices. And before we go any further, we want to note that all of these plans are equal or end up with the same expected value. Regardless of what you choose here, you're essentially going to end up with $40,000 in the budget. On the left, you save $40,000 in option A, and on the right, option A has you losing $60,000, which means you'll also be left with $40,000. So these are the same. And then on the left in option B, we see there's a 40% chance you'll keep all $100,000 here on the right. And here on the left, there's a 40% chance that you'll lose nothing, which also means keep all $100,000. So we're just pointing out that there are no actual differences between any of the plans in terms of how much your school district will save. So what is different between these two scenarios? What's different is the way that they are framed. One is framed positively. It uses language about what you can save, and the other one is framed negatively. It talks about what can be lost. In both scenarios, people are presented with a sure thing, which is option A for both scenarios, or a gamble, which is option B. The way people respond to sure things versus a gamble shifts dramatically based on whether they're presented with a positive or negative framing. So when presented with a positive frame, the overwhelming majority of respondents choose the sure thing. When things are framed positively, we want the sure thing. We want to make sure we save something. However, the decision is the opposite when things are framed negatively. Here now, the gamble sounds really good. We don't like the idea of choosing a sure loss. We'd rather gamble and maybe we won't lose anything. So even though all of these plans are the same regardless of the scenario, the respondents chose differently based on how that plans were presented to them or framed. And this is a powerful effect that applies across our daily lives. Just the way something is worded can have a powerful effect on the way we make choices. In the framing effect, equivalent information can be more or less attractive depending on what features are highlighted. And we see here in this little comic that although these frozen yogurts have the exact same fat content, they both have 20% fat and are both 80% fat-free, this consumer here has a very clear preference for one over the other, even though they're exactly the same. And that is because of the way the information is framed or the framing effect. In this video, we will be discussing the sunk cost fallacy. This is an error in judgment that leads us to remain committed to something we've already invested time, effort, or money in, even if the ongoing costs outweigh the benefits. So let's take a look at a few ways this could play out. In this classic study, you assume you bought a $100 ticket for a ski trip to Michigan. And then a little while later, you buy a cheaper one for Wisconsin, and you think you'll like that trip better. But then you realize that they're on the same weekend, and the tickets are not refundable, and you can only go to one. The participants in the study had to choose one of the options that you see here below, either go on the $100 ski trip to Michigan or the $50 ski trip to Wisconsin, which are on the same day. And here we can see that 54% of participants chose the more expensive trip and 46% chose the less expensive trip. Now, why are these results somewhat surprising? Because it says right here that you think you're going to enjoy the cheaper trip to Wisconsin more. So less than half of the participants in this experiment are going on the trip that they will enjoy more. And this is due to something called the sunk cost. Sunk cost is something that is irretrievably gone and thus should not affect future decision making. And we say shouldn't here in this definition because it very strongly does impact decision making. So in this case, the fact that the ski trip to Michigan costs more influences people's thinking about which trip to choose. In the scenario in the study, you're out losing $150 no matter what. It's gone and there's no retrieving it. That cost is sunk, but it's still impacting participants' decisions and leading them to go on the trip they will enjoy less simply because it cost more. Here's a comic that illustrates the idea of how sunk costs often influences our decisions. So in this example, the man is sitting through a movie that's terrible simply to get his money or hear his arm and legs worth. But sunk costs don't only have to do with finances. They also have to do with time and level of investment. Oftentimes, we don't walk away from things at the right time. So we don't walk away from relationships or projects or work. We don't walk away from the dumpster fire because we don't want to lose all the time and energy that we put into it. Even though staying or sticking it out does not help us regain our time or energy, and often results in us losing even more time and energy on something that might negatively impact our life and our work. The sunk cost fallacy sometimes plays out in the context of student work in the classroom. In one study, students were given a sheet of math problems to work out and were told to work through until they reached the stop sign and then wait for instructions. Then, once all the children had finished their work, the experimenters went around and gave them each a second sheet of problems. And you'll note that the new sheet had the same number of problems as there were left to finish on the first sheet, and that's important. So the researchers tell the students you need to finish one worksheet, choose which one to complete. Now remember, there are the same number of problems on each worksheet, so you would think that the responses would be randomly divided over how many students choose to complete the first worksheet versus the second worksheet. But based on what we just learned about sunk cost, it's not surprising that way more students than can be attributed to chance chose to complete the first worksheet. Researchers have termed this the partial assignment completion effect, which in essence says that students are more likely to work on an assignment that they have already started than one that they have not yet begun. One interesting thing to note in the study is that researchers gave some participants an option with fewer problems to complete. And in this case, more students did choose the shorter option, and the partial assignment completion effect wasn't as large, but still a quarter of the students chose to complete the first sheet of problems, despite it being longer. In the previous lessons in this module, we reviewed these 10 types of cognitive biases and heuristics. They happen, and they sometimes, though not always, lead to errors. But there's one more point to know about when it comes to biases and heuristics, which is the blind spot bias. This is our tendency to notice biases in others' reasoning, but fail to pick up on our own biases. And the importance of knowing about this blind spot is so that we can constantly check ourselves and notice it in others. Let's look at how researchers have explored this tendency. In one set of studies, what researchers did was stop people in the airport. So they stopped them and they had them read this little blurb shown here. And the blurb said, psychologists have claimed that people show a self-serving tendency in the way they view their academic or job performance. That is, they tend to take credit for success, but deny responsibility for failure. They see their successes as a result of personal qualities like drive or ability, but their failures as a result of external factors like unreasonable work requirements or inadequate instruction. So this may sound familiar to something we addressed earlier in the module, which is the fundamental attribution error, or the way we tend to overemphasize the influence of personal characteristics on an outcome. This blurb here adds a little more nuance. The tendency to over-attribute personal characteristics varies depending on the type of situation, so whether it's a positive or negative situation, a success or a failure. And it depends on the role you play in the scenario. Are you the actor, like our stick figure friend from earlier who was late because of traffic, or are you the observer, his friends who responded to his lateness? Okay, so back to the study. They showed this blurb to travelers at an airport, and they had them rate one of two things. First, they had people rate how much they thought this self-serving tendency applied to Americans overall, and then they rated how much they thought it applied to themselves. What they found is that people think the average American is very biased. You can see here it's close to 70%. But they think that they themselves are not biased. And this has been demonstrated in many different studies. So the idea here is that while everyone acknowledges there's bias in the world, we tend to think, and more importantly, it really feels like we ourselves are not biased. But obviously we see the fallacy here. If everyone says everyone else is biased but their own selves, this is not mathematically possible. And even when educated about these biases, people tend to think they still don't apply to them. So the blind spot bias is very pervasive. In this module, we've learned about these cognitive biases here, and we've learned that even when people know about them, they're still often blind to their own biases. But let's end this module with some good news. There are many strategies that enable us to reduce these biases and to mitigate the errors caused by some of these heuristics. So the first example of a strategy to reduce bias relates to the representativeness heuristic. A study was conducted with children from Italy, and one of the questions in the study was, in your town, are there more sporting events or soccer events? And of course, we know, having talked about the representativeness heuristic earlier in the module, that the correct answer with no more information is sporting events, because soccer games are just a subset of sporting events. But a large chunk of the children in these studies said soccer games. And as we know, this is because a soccer game is likely a more representative type of town sporting event for children in Italy. So they incorrectly overestimated the likelihood that there would be more soccer games than just general sporting events. But the researchers also gave another group of children a quick training to teach them a little bit about categories, and this is what they showed them. And here they explained that a canary is necessarily a bird, and how a bird is necessarily an animal. So if they're asked to estimate how large a group is with no other knowledge, it would be smart to say that there are more animals than birds, because it wouldn't be possible for the number of birds to be more than the number of animals. It would have to be less than or equal to the number of animals. And what researchers found is that after the training, students were still making some mistakes in their estimates, but there were far fewer than in the group with no training. So just a brief training was enough to mitigate some of the errors caused by the representativeness heuristic. Let's move on to a strategy for reducing the fundamental attribution error, which we just talked about in the last video. If you remember back to earlier in the module, we examined a study in which participants read someone else's essay, and they were explained the circumstances in which they wrote it, and then they had to make some judgments about the writers and what they really believed. So what researchers did with some participants in the study is that before they asked them to answer the questions about the essay they read, they were told that they were later going to be called on to justify the impressions they had of the essay writer to a research assistant. It was just a random research assistant, no big deal, but just this little warning helped even out the personality attributions between the people that were forced to write the favoring essay and the people who were forced to write the opposition essays. It didn't fully eliminate the discrepancies. This is a very strong bias, but this small level of accountability did reduce the difference in the attributions of the personality. Now let's talk about polarized thinking and explore a way to potentially reduce it. If you remember from earlier in the module, polarized thinking, which is sometimes known as binary thinking, leads us to instinctively simplify things to the extreme. So it's black or white, good or bad, always or never, with no room for gray areas or other possibilities in between. So in one study, participants were asked to rate how much they agreed with certain statements, sort of like the statements you see here. And then they were asked to imagine a person on the other side of the liberal conservative political spectrum and to consider how much they believed people on that other side would agree or disagree about the same statements. And as is to be expected, the answers most people gave when answering from the perspectives on the other side of the political spectrum were quite different from their own answers. Polarization in their answers was clearly evident. So the intervention that researchers thought might reduce polarized thinking was something called forecasting. Forecasting is a technique of using current and historical data to make informed estimates to determine what you think might happen in the future, or to make estimates about future events. So what researchers did as part of this intervention was they recruited all participants to be part of a forecasting initiative, but only some of the participants actually made forecasting decisions while the others did not. Every couple of weeks over the span of 2 years, participants were given 2 to 3 questions to answer, which all had binary yes or no outcomes, and for which they had to make forecasting predictions. So example of questions included predictions about current, at the time, geopolitical events. So for example, will President Trump announce that the United States will pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership during the first 100 days of his administration? And on this graph here, we can see that researchers captured participants' attitude strength, or how strongly participants felt about topics across different domains. And as you can see, the participants that were forecasters, which are represented by the green bars, meaning those who engaged in a process to gather information so they could make statistical predictions, were less extreme in their attitude strength than participants who did not engage in forecasting. Those folks were represented by the blue bars. And what's also interesting is that the forecasters, or the folks who gained practice with forecasting and predicting the future, also became less polarized in how they thought about other people's attitudes. So again, you can see these green bars were the forecasters, the blue bars are the non-forecasters, and the forecasters' attitudes were just not quite as polarized. So in summary, researchers have identified examples of interventions or strategies that can help us to reduce the errors from some cognitive biases. So remember, a brief training was enough to reduce the representativeness heuristic. Some small level of accountability was enough to reduce the fundamental attribution error. And engaging in training around prediction and forecasting impacted the tendency towards polarized thinking. There are other techniques and decision tools that can be used to mitigate some of these biases, or at least provide interruptive moments when we notice it would be useful to override our System 1 automatic thinking by employing our System 2.